Robert, you can take it away.
Thank you, Jamie. Give me a second to get my screen shared. And how's that, guys? Good?
See it?
Oh. Are you getting the full screen there?
Yep, it's coming up right now.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting us to talk today. My understanding is that the group here has some interest in land development, but maybe not some proficiency in some of the major issues. So I'll just introduce myself again real quickly. I'm Robert LaRocco, Planning Board Administrator. What that means for you specifically is that if you need to go to a public hearing in order to get a development project started, approved, or through what's called the entitlement process, your first step is going to be our department and working specifically with me and the planners that I work with to get an application submitted, reviewed, and approved by the planning board. My background is I worked for, started my career at City of Rapid City, South Dakota, got my graduate degree at the University of Iowa, go Hawkeyes, and moved to the City of Omaha about 4 years ago. But I won't delay because we've got a dense presentation. Because of the density of this presentation, I wanted to provide you guys with a lot of links. So you will have, we will make sure we get this, these presentations to Jamie so that they can be distributed to you and you'll have those links available to you. But so first off, we needed to set some, have a basis for where the development in the city comes from. And the document that the City of Omaha uses to guide our future and our decision-making process is known as the Omaha Master Plan. And forgive me if you're familiar with this, but I'm gonna move forward as though you're not. When we look at the master plan, what we're really talking about is it's a conversation about sustainability. And when we're talking about sustainability, a lot of times when you hear that come up, you're hearing it come up in only an environmental sense. Oh. But I think if you look at the master plan and take some time to study it, you'll see that sustainability in the community and the community of Omaha is really about three central tenets. Yes, there's an environmental impact. We want to make sure that the long-term decisions that we make don't have negative impact on the environment that we live in. But there's also an economical impact that we want to try and balance with that environment. We want to make sure that we're making good decisions to improve the economy and economics of the community. And we also want to look at this from the perspective of social equity. So when we're talking about social equity, we're talking about things like affordable housing. We're talking about access to jobs. We're talking about access to transportation and making development decisions that positively impact the marginalized and less representative demographics and populations in our community. And part of that, there's that fourth E there that I discussed. It's the idea of energy, which kind of fits into all three of those previous categories. And where are we getting our energy from? How are we using it? Who has access to it? What are they paying for it? So when you take a look at the master plan, I think you'll see that the goals and objectives that we create in there really are focused on the long-term examination and implementation of policies to address those three or four things. So I will provide this link here, maybe. Oh, come on. It's going to be difficult if we don't have any links working here today, guys. See if I can figure out how to reduce this down a little bit.
I think if you hit that enable editing button, it might let you click links.
Let's try it. There we go. So that link is, thank you for that, Matthew.
I've been there, so.
So the link is to the master plan, which is available at the City of Omaha website. The two things that you really want to be with the focus that you guys are at, take a look at the concept element, which provides a vision for Omaha's future. You can see it's broken down by categories and there's different elements.
Robert, can I interrupt you for just a minute? Are you on the City of Omaha master plan site right now?
Yes, I am.
It's only showing your screen for your slides. You might have to switch your screens real quick, or maybe change it to your desktop view.
Okay. Let's try that again.
In the meantime, are there any questions that anybody has as he's pulling that up?
Is that working for you guys?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. So again, we're at the city page, web page. There's the master plan. It's derived of a series of different elements that address different items. I'll be honest with you, I haven't gone through all of these, but I have gone through the future land use element, which is really geared towards looking at the how we see the city developing in the future. Without getting into too much of that, we'll keep going here. But take a look at that resource. So using that Omaha master plan as well as these two tools of the trade really they're going to be critically important for you moving forward and being able to find information yourselves, make decisions with that. The first one is called Dogis. And again, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dogis, but it's a free mapping service, geographical information service that provides massive amounts of information about the community. So I've gone to that link and I'll just show you some of these features really quick. You can search by a property. So just for an example, I'll use our office here in 1819 Farnham Street. What that allows us to do is bring up that parcel. You see here on the left, you'll see that there's a link to the assessor's webpage where you can get information about the ownership, parcel numbers, legal descriptions, values, locations, maps, things like that. Very valuable. And then it allows you to click on a site and we'll bring up that, or we'll zoom into that property. And there's a lot of information right at your fingertips. So obviously you've got that aerial view, which is always, this is from 2020. I'll show you here on the bottom of the screen. There also is historical photographs available. So if you're looking for property history, this will go back all the way to the 30s. That's kind of a nice feature. You'll see here, there's blue outlines. That's a method of displaying the zoning, which is going to be important to your land development regulation. Addresses, streets, that's just as it starts up. There's also features like topography and contours, utility lines, sewer lines, different ways of displaying the zoning. And one thing in particular that I really want to show you is the future land use plan. So the future land use plan will be kind of the next steps in this conversation here is a guiding, it's an element of the future land use plan in the master plan the link that I showed you earlier. But what this provides us is a map of when a property develops or redevelops, how do we see that developing in the future? So zooming way out, I'll just click on the layer and what you'll see those different colors. And those colors indicate what type of development we see or what we anticipate happening. You'll notice the primary color is yellow. That yellow would stand for single family residential. The red is going to be office and commercial. And you'll see that it kind of lays out in a grid. Well, you'll notice that that's Dodge, that's Maple, there's Center, there's Interstate 80. That gray is actually industrial. So you see industrial uses centered around our transit corridors. You'll also see this pink, which would be our downtown. And you'll see this orange, which is new. This is indicating an area that is our newly adopted transit-oriented development corridor. Those are areas we see as redeveloping in the future with a higher density centered around our new orbit lines. The other item that, a couple items I do want to show you here with this future land use is the mixed use areas. Hard to see from this far perspective, but if we'll go out west here and zoom in and let the layers load again, and you'll see that there are certain areas that are surrounded by that dark brick colored dotted line. And what that is indicating is an area of that we see as developing with a mix of uses. And that mix of uses could be a combination of low density residential, high density residential, commercial uses, office uses. We want to see those zoning districts kind of mixed together and see those uses mixing together. Again, that's all laid out as a part of that master plan, the reasoning for it, the spacing of it. But it impacts you if you're looking at properties to develop and you see you're within a mixed use corridor or density area. You're going to have the opportunity or have some more flexibility in what you want to develop, the densities that you want to develop at, you can look at doing like a vertical integration of uses. So you would have commercial or office uses on one floor and residential uses on a second floor or above that. It just gives you some flexibility. What you see when you take a look at that on this map, that those mixed use areas are identified as in that master plan for specific sizes. So again, we'll let the layer come up here, maybe. And all of those triangles represent a major intersection in the city that we see developing with that mix of uses. So we want to promote that mix of uses in specific areas while still protecting the character of the neighborhoods around those mix of uses. So each of those different types of, or different colored triangles and sizes of triangles indicates a different type of mixed use community. Generally, those are going to be based on size. 60 acre center or a 30 acre center or a 10 acre center. So the value of the future land use plan is your ability to take a look at if you've got a site and you have an idea, would that idea be possible at that site? It's not always going to be the underlying zoning of a property that's going to tell you whether or not you can do a project. You might have a process by which you need to rezone the property, which we're going to get into. And this is going to help you guide your decision-making process and what is available to you in that. All right, let's get back to this. The other tool that you really want to be aware of is the municipal code. You can do a Google search for Omaha Muni Code, and you'll bring up this webpage. The two important chapters for you in the land development business are going to be chapters 53, subdivisions, and chapter 55, zoning. I'm going to get into both of those briefly. Again, we're based on the density of this. We can't do everything, but that link will be provided for you. All right. Let's start with subdivision. At its basics, subdivision is the creation of new lots for the purposes of transfer. If you have a property that you want to carve off a part of it and sell it or buy it, you'll go through the subdivision process. In the city of Omaha, not everywhere, but in the city of Omaha, it also is a means by which you secure your development rights. So if you have an unplatted parcel out west, for example, that's never been built on, you don't actually have development rights on that property and don't have the ability to build on it until it's been subdivided. Most of the properties in redevelopment areas, i.e. in the more central areas of the city, those are going to be previously platted, or they're going to be comprised of portions of lots. So you're going to have situations where you're going to need to subdivide just to create an actual lot. You don't have a whole lot, but you've got a portion of a lot. Generally, those are broken up into 3 different types of subdivisions, or you'll hear them called plats by the planners in the office as well. Administrative, minor, and then the full platting process. The intent of a subdivision is to basically install infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I mean right-of-way, pavement, curb, gutter, water, sanitary sewer, storm sewer, sidewalks, and streetlights. You, as the developer, are responsible for installing all of those with any development that you undertake. There is going to be some other things that you may have to consider, like your drainage and stormwater retention, erosion and sediment control, driveways, traffic controls if you need to put in stop signs or stoplights. But all of that is going to need to be dealt with if you have to go through the subdivision process. The way you go through the subdivision process, you'll work with city planning and public works. I think I don't know if Ryan's intent is to at least mention subdivision agreements, but Ryan's definitely going to be the more experienced expert on subdivision agreements, which is just a document that's used to control the specific design and requirements of all this infrastructure that you may be required to install. One note real quick is that if you're working on areas that are outside the city limits, but still within Douglas County, you might also have to include the Douglas County Engineer's Office. But when you're going through that process, you're going to hear the phrase coordinate with public works a lot. Without getting too far into subdivisions, because we could spend an entire 2 hours just on that, I want you to be aware that depending on the property that you're looking at developing, you may be required to subdivide that. And subdivision can come with some pretty exorbitant expenses. We've seen a lot of development proposals that have not gone forward based on the cost of infrastructure alone. One thing to be aware of. Moving forward, this is really what I've been trying to get to. So chapter 55 is our zoning ordinance. And Tim's going to go into portions of this as well, but and I'm not expecting you, there's not going to be a test, but there is a beginning to all this zoning, which started in 1926. There's a Supreme Court case called Euclid versus Amber Realty. And that's not important to know, but what is important to know is that out of that, which was a very basic zoning ordinance, there were 2 characteristics that came out of zoning, or came out that are still applied to zoning today. That is use and the physical characteristics. So what I mean by that is that most zoning ordinances, including the city of Omaha's, are broken into 2 distinct parts. The first would be what uses are going to be allowed on a given piece of property. And the second would be, how is that going to be designed? How are those lots going to be designed? So you see there, in the city of Omaha and most communities, you'll see that have a Euclidean zoning basis. The use types are broken into residential, commercial, civic, industrial, mixed uses. You'll see office in the city of Omaha's zoning ordinance as well. But they all increase in intensity of use. So your agricultural uses obviously are going to be at the bottom, or preservation uses. But then as you move up, it's residential. And then commercial and office uses are seen as more intense in use than residential uses. And civic uses are kind of on that same level. industrial uses are at the highest level of intensity. And we generally want to keep those zoning districts separated or logically transitioning from one to the next. In other words, you don't want to put a leather tannery next to an elementary school. The uses are not compatible. The industrial use is not compatible with the civic use. And in doing that, or in trying to establish that framework of uses, we go with use regulators. So some uses are going to be permitted, some are conditional, special, and there's a couple other things in there as well that we have called planned unit developments and mixed use development plans. But a permitted use is a use that's permitted by right. If you've got a zoning district where you want to have a single family residence and that's all you want to put on that site, the use is in some districts, most districts, that use is permitted. You can go ensure that you meet your design regulations on the right side there and go get a building permit to put that use on the site. A conditional use requires approval. Generally here in the city of Omaha, that approval is contingent upon the planning board. And then underneath that, you'll see special use permits. That's contingent upon planning approval by the planning board and city council. I'll let Tim touch on planned unit developments because that's really going to be a design related feature. Not so much concerned with the use of the property, but more the design. But mixed use development plans are also a very special situation where you are locking in a set of uses and a set of design regulations. So you can have some flexibility in design, but in exchange for that, the city is going to want to see plans that are much more concrete and agreed upon by a group of people. If that's not complicated enough, I'll also touch on at this point overlay districts. If we can go back to that zoning ordinance quick, one thing you'll see, this is an example in the zoning. This is, again, the building I'm sitting in right now, the City School Administration Center. And when we bring up the zoning, bring up the colored zoning because it's more fun. You see there's the red brick color is the zoning district. And then there's a hatching there, or a dotted layer on there that signifies that this is within an ACI overlay district. That ACI provides additional requirements with regards to design. So your building has to look a certain way, it has to be fronting a street a certain way, needs to be built with certain materials. ACI districts are intended, like the ACI here means area of civic importance. So this is an area we've deemed to be important to the community as a whole. So we want to use enhanced design requirements for new buildings in those areas. There's lots of different overlays. In my floodplain work, I work with flood fringe and floodway overlay districts, which I don't recommend you get into, but if you really want to get into that, we can. That's indicated here, showing that that property is located in a floodway and has specific requirements for what can and cannot be built there and to what standards those have to be built to. So on the other side of the zoning is design regulation. If you were to, we can go to the zoning ordinance real quick. I think I still have up. And we take a look at.
Robert, can I interrupt you for just a minute? Hey, Brad, do you want to just throw out your question? I think that's a really good question to ask right now before we get too much further into all the acronym soup.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I was just curious where you find the breakdown of what some of those things mean. Like I pull that up and see ACI, I'm not gonna have a clue. Is there a general place that we can find kind of where that's all spelled out so we understand what those actually mean?
Yes, thank you for asking that. And actually, I'll direct your attention here to the zoning ordinance. Again, one of those items that I strongly recommend you spend some time getting very familiar with, but where'd it go? There it is. there is a section that's devoted to overlay districts. So you see there, the PUD, the Planned Unit Development District, is an overlay that's identified there. And under that section, if you go to the purpose there, it gives you a brief overlay of what PUD stands for, and then also what its intent is to do. So you've got like NCE, Neighborhood Conservation Enhancement, ACI, Area of Civic Importance. So there is a section of the code. It's Article 11 that specifically deals with overlay districts.
Robert,
Good.
would you have any suggestions, or anybody on the panel have any suggestions on where, like, what would just be a good general source on some public sector acronyms related to planning and public works?
You know, I don't know of a document that city planning has available that lays out what all those acronyms are, but that zoning ordinance. Tim, are you aware of something?
This is Bridget. I'm not aware of any location where those acronyms are.
Tim, you're cutting in and out, man.
I was having some internet issues.
Let's let him work on his internet issues before he's got to speak.
This is Winsley.
Winsley, I think, has a comment.
Yes, the International Council of Shopping Centers.
I'm going to get into some of
the International Council of Shopping Centers, or ICSC, has a handbook of.
Sorry about
it's
that.
basically.
I know I'm going to.
It's a real estate definitions, basically dictionary, and that is a very helpful tool for those folks who are new to the development side, and it has all sorts of stuff that is necessary to know.
Okay. I'm going to continue because the meat and potatoes of all this is really these design regulations. If you were to look at the zoning ordinance, just as an example, we'll go to commercial districts because they have so many good regulations. Again, permitted uses, conditional uses, special uses, and they lay out everything that would be allowed or would require special hearing within the zoning ordinance. And then you'll see a section, every single section in the zoning ordinance, whether it be in relationship to commercial districts, residential districts, each one of those sections is going to have a subheading called site development regulations. And when you go to that, sorry, throw that over here. When you go to that, it comes up with a table in the zoning ordinance, which lays out the regulator and the requirements in that zoning district. So what you would do is you have a property, you can go to DOGIS to determine what that zoning on that property is. You find that it's CC district, and you want to do a commercial development on the site. So you can go to the zoning ordinance, and this lays out how that site has to be presented. It has to be a minimum of 5,000 square feet with a lot width of 50 feet. Floor area ratio, which is a measurement of density, has to be a maximum of 1.0. The front yard setback needs to be 25 feet from the property line. And that's a note I'll stress. A lot of, when you're talking about setbacks, there's some questions about how those are measured. These are all measured from the property lines in the city of Omaha. So knowing where your property lines are at is going to be important. Front yard, street side yard, interior side yard, there is none. in this zoning district, but in a residential zoning district, you might have to provide 10 or 15 feet from the side property line. Rear yard, building height, building coverage, which is the square foot or the footprint of the building divided by the size of the lot, and impervious coverage, which is the square or the building footprint and all the pavement on a property divided by the size of the lot. And you'll see, obviously, they indicate no more than 60% of your lots can be building. No more than 85% of your lot can be building or pavement. And that's to allow for green space, just space between developments, and also it's a function of site drainage. You'll see that, you know, lower density single family residential homes are going to require more separation, deeper setbacks, and less building coverage. But higher density commercial developments, especially downtown or in neighborhood business districts, don't require any or would allow for 100% building coverage, 100% impervious coverage, no setbacks, no parking requirements. So again, it's a demonstration of that intensity of use. The zoning regulators allow for a sliding scale of decreasing the intensity of use or increasing the intensity of use based on these design characteristics. These are the things that each one of those that subsection that I pointed out in the zoning ordinance, these are going to be addressed no matter what. I should always note, with a few exceptions. Parking is going to be in its own separate section, but when you're designing parking, you are, in most districts, going to be required to provide off-street parking for whatever development you're doing. And that off-street parking must meet design requirements and a minimum number of parking spaces that's based on the type of use that you're putting in there. For example, a restaurant requires one parking space for every 4 capacity. What you find out is that restaurants require a whole lot of parking. But a single family residence only requires 2 parking spaces. A studio apartment only requires 1 parking space. So that's how those parking requirements are determined. There's also landscaping and buffering, which I think I'll leave more to Tim. And then again, not to make things more complicated, but there are specific uses that are going to have their own special set of regulations. Something like townhomes would be a good example of that, where the minimum lot size requirements and setbacks are going to change based on putting in townhomes as opposed to putting in, say, single family detached residence. What this really means is it's always going to be important for you to coordinate with city planning staff so you're not missing something. If you've got a project, you know, a single family residence isn't hard, but if you're starting to add in different types of uses, reach out to our departments so that we can make sure you're not missing that supplemental regulation with regards to townhomes. And then the last thing I'll note there is that there's a process called waivers that would allow you to ignore all of those regulations. I've included, and I'm going way over on time, so I've included some examples of a site plan so that you can see, like, for example, when you're measuring a setback, there's the property line and the setback is to the structure. So in this instance,
Robert, like if you're showing us another screen, we're still seeing the code, municipal code.
Really? What is going on?
Okay. I think you have to select when you change tabs. You have to select, like, on the share screen button. You can choose to change to see the next tab that you've tabbed to.
How's it going, guys?
There it goes. Yep.
There you go.
So I've got an example of a site plan. You're seeing building envelopes, driveways, property lines. This is showing stormwater, utilities, what a typical setback would be, and also what these people are proposing to do here, which wouldn't meet those requirements. And a site statistics table here in the lower right-hand corner that kind of lays out all those minimum requirements and provided requirements. Basically, any development that you do in the city of Omaha, you're going to require a site plan. So it's something you'll want to take a close look at. It's worth spending the time and money and getting a good site plan. We will take something on a line sheet of paper, but we won't be happy about it. I think that's some advice that I would give. This is an example of a landscaping plan. So very similar to the site plan, except for it's showing the number and species of vegetation that we would require in a development or a proposed development. Something for you to take a closer look at. And then building elevations. So when we want to measure the building height, we would use a building elevation. One thing that I want you to understand is there's a difference between a building elevation and a rendering. This is a building elevation, and this allows us, it's got a scale. It's hard to see there, but it's got a scale, and it tells us how tall that building is. We can put a scale on that and make that determination. This is a rendering. It looks nice, but I couldn't tell you how tall that building is based on that picture. I couldn't tell you where the building coverage is based on that picture. I think renderings really bring a development project to life, but elevations are what we need to make sure you comply with the code. So all of this, what your intent is to get a building permit to build a building or to rehab a building. All of this discussion about subdivision and zoning and the master plan really gets funneled into this right here, which is about the two areas where if you need to work with city planning and get an approval for something, you're going to go in these two directions. The first is the planning board. And as I noted at the top of this, I'm the planning board administrator. So I would help you guide you through this process. And can everybody see this? I should keep noting. I should probably just keep up on making sure of that.
Yep, we can see it.
So if you need to subdivide, if you need to rezone your property because the zoning wouldn't allow for what you want to do, if you need a use permit because the type of use that you want to do requires previous approval, or planned development, mixed use development plans, then you would go through the planning board. One thing that I want to point out in particular, and Bridget is on this call, thankfully, is TIF, tax increment financing. It is a tool that we can use to help defer some of the costs, especially for infrastructure. And if you want to have a broader discussion on TIF, by all means, talk with Bridget. She's our resident expert on the subject matter. But you should be aware that TIF has a slightly different process. While you do go to the planning board, you also have to go to the separate TIF committee. But that is definitely a tool that you'll see developers use to help make a project more attainable. You'll see other applications come through like vacations of right of way and disposal of city property. That can be something that you'd be interested in if you have a piece of property that the city bought decades ago and never did anything with. There might be an opportunity to have that property disposed of. So then you would have development opportunities there from a formerly owned city property. But the thing to remember about planning board is that it's almost entirely a recommending board, which means that whatever you get approved at the planning board is going to almost certainly have to go forward to city council. The exception to that is conditional use permits. On the other side of the board is the zoning board of appeals. And I said a couple slides ago that there was a way to ignore all of those development regulations. That's what the zoning board of appeals is intended to do. Now, we don't want you to ignore zoning board or zoning regulations, but if there is something wrong with your property that would not allow you to develop your property, then you would have this zoning board of appeals as a way to say, I can't possibly meet the setbacks or the impervious coverage on this site. So I'm requesting relief from that zoning regulation. But this is what I have to stress with regard to the Zoning Board of Appeals. Money is not a hardship. So just because it's going to cost more for you to develop your property is not a justification for you getting a waiver. Just because you might be able to make more money on your property does not mean that you should get a waiver for it. There needs to be something wrong with your property. Now, these are both public hearings, and I'm not a planning board member or a zoning board member. I'm just the administrator. The board has the final say as to whether or not your use is appropriate, or in the case of the Zoning Board of Appeals, whether your request for relief is appropriate. Both the boards do notification and advertisement, meaning that they put an ad in the paper saying that this case is going to be heard, and they notify people within a certain distance of your property boundary that you have a request that's going to go before the board. Both of the boards would allow for public testimony and hearing. So if there are people that are opposed to your request, it's possible that they would come out and say, we do not want this in our neighborhood. You'll see articles in the newspaper, on the news all the time about neighborhoods that do not want a project coming in. The best way to stop that from happening is very early in your process, you need to communicate well with the neighborhood that you want to develop in. Talk with them, show them your plans or the plans that you have available. Be open, transparent as possible, and listen to them. Take their concerns into consideration. The easiest way to avoid having an item blow up at planning board is to talk with the neighborhood beforehand. When you make an application to the planning board, there will be a recommendation that my department puts together and presents to the board. And then the board votes. Generally, just a simple majority is required for your development proposal or your request to pass. Zoning board would work the same way. But I should also note the zoning board is a quasi judicial board, which means that if you get your waiver, it can't be appealed. It can't, or if your waiver is denied, you can't appeal it to the city council. There's no other place to go but to a court, to the district court, in order to try and get that ruling overturned. So the zoning board of appeals is, that's why we don't like to approve appeals or waivers. It's because we don't want to set a precedence by which our zoning ordinance isn't being enforced. So all that, this leads to this, which I think you guys have had access to in the past. This is available on the city webpage. It's just a graph or an outline of our development process. A couple things to note: the pre-application meeting here, which would be your ability to take your plans, throw them out on a table in front of city staff and say, this is what I want to do. How do I go about doing this? Similarly, the site plan review would allow you to send in a set of plans to our department, and we'll take the time to review it for compliance with zoning regulations and subdivision regulations, and let you know what things you need to change or if you're ready to go. And all of this leads to, this is the process that I just discussed. But if you meet code, then you can go straight to the building permit stage, which also operates through city planning, but would require you to provide construction drawings rather than the site plans and landscaping plans that we've been discussing. We need to see construction drawings. That's going to be signed and sealed by a registered surveyor or engineer. Those are going to provide definitive details on how a wall section is going to be built, how thick a pavement section is going to be built, where is your stormwater drainage going to flow to. Those are going to be the technically precise documents needed in order to get a building permit. Building permits are reviewed internally. There's no public hearing process involved as a part of that. City planning would review a request, as well as our code inspectors or plans examiners. You'll see fire department will get involved. And public works will get involved in a couple different aspects depending on what type of project you're working on. And assuming that you meet your zoning codes and meet all your building codes, then you get a building permit issued, which is of course the end goal for all of this. We didn't have anybody from our buildings division in here today, but again, that could be a whole other series of lectures on the building code process. That's what I've got. I know that was a ton of information, and I know that Tim and Ryan still have a ton to go. But what have you got for me? I'll try and answer anything that I can, or toss it to Ryan and Tim.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was a lot of great information and a lot of detail that I think is super helpful for everybody that's trying to navigate this process and understand all the ins and outs. Satyam has a question or comment, I think, that he'd like to ask. Go for it.
Yeah, I think you answered it on the next slide, but it looks like the planning board is where we would start when first deciding what to do with a piece of vacant land or an existing building. Is that correct? It's kind of the first point of contact.
I think your first point of contact, we don't want to send anybody to the planning board unless we have to. For no other reason than it is more work for me or more work for all of us. So your first point of contact would be having a discussion with staff, myself. There's a guy in our office named Mike Carter, who's a great resource as well. Tim Fries will be another one that you're going to talk with frequently, and Ryan. That's why we're all three of us on this presentation. Is we're going to be your primary or first points of contact. If we can get you to a point where you can get a building permit without having to go to planning board, I think we would all prefer that. It's always going to be easier for everybody involved. But you should be aware that this process exists and some of the basics of what's entailed about having to go to planning board. But yeah, I would suggest that myself, Ryan Haas, and Tim Fries are good first contacts. And also Bridget, if you're working on TIF, if you've got a TIF project in mind.
Great. Thank you again, Robert. Appreciate it. We are going to move right into Tim's presentation if he's ready to go. If y'all need to take a quick break, just go ahead and do that whenever and however you like. And Tim, are you good to go?
Jamie, this is Ryan. Tim and I were discussing, and I was going to go next, if that's all right.
Okay, that sounds great.
All right, let me share my screen here. All right, can everyone see my presentation?
We can, if you could just maximize your slide that you're, there you go.
Okay, so kind of like Robert, I am going to jump around a little bit with some visual aids. But just to start off with, again, my name is Ryan Haas. I'm a civil engineer with the Department of Public Works here at the City of Omaha. My role in the development process is to kind of help to administer the things that entail infrastructure that involve the Public Works Department. So while I do work for a separate department, I work very closely with the planning department, kind of an honorary member of their department, I guess. I put together a page of resources here, and both my presentation and another document I did share with Jamie, and she'll be able to pass along to any of the attendees who would like the documents as resources. But again, there is some overlap with the things that Robert talked about and the things that I was going to talk about, so I'll kind of gloss over those. But I just can't stress enough how much information is available publicly, free to the public on DOGIS. The disclaimer that I referenced, that's just to say that it's 95 to 98% accurate. There are some things that are not completely accurate, and there are mistakes sometimes. So it should be looked at as a guide a very helpful guide, but it doesn't replace the need for certain things as you go through these processes, like the need for a surveyor, the need for an engineer, if that comes about on your project. Just as an example, you can see a surveyed fence line here. That's going to be the actual property line. So the property line shown on DOGIS is shifted off of the true property line. So that's just an example. But that being said, there's a lot of information here. The one thing that I'm going to point out today is the sewers layer, and I'll get into that here in a little bit, and also the ability to see the legal description of your lot. So, for example, this is Ridgeview Terrace Lot 15. If you have a legal description like that, that indicates that your property has been platted previously. Well, actually, I'm going to jump out. I'll come back to the lot versus parcel question here a little bit. Just to kind of expand a little bit on what Robert was saying about points of contact, this is the very first place that you should think about. If you have a concept, if you have an idea, if you own a piece of property or you're thinking about buying a property and you want to propose a project on the property or a different land use, this would be the place to call first, would be the planning help desk. Just as an anecdote, I did check in with the assistant planning director the other day before committing his department's resources in a public presentation, and he appreciated the gesture, but so he laughed that I did ask. But then he made the point that that's what this resource is for those kind of high level questions, those first when you're in the information gathering stage, is to call there, and then from there they can either answer your questions or maybe point you down some of these paths that for processes that Robert was talking about for further coordination with staff. So as for my department, there's dozens of people that work in my department that have some involvement directly or indirectly with development processes. So my recommendation would be, if you have a public works related question, to call our main number here and describe what information you're looking for. And our receptionist is good at pointing in the right direction as far as which staff member to discuss your questions with. So with that, I did put municipal code here, and Robert linked to that. My only reason for linking it or putting it in my presentation is I just want to point out that as city staff, our role is to kind of help you know what processes you're up against, and Robert laid those out in great detail. But when we kind of tell you, okay, here's what could be allowed on your site, here's what uses, or here's what improvements you're going to have to construct, just keep in mind that we're essentially, as staff, we are the messengers, and all of the authority comes from city council, comes from the master plan and city code. And so when we tell you these things, we're not ever looking to saddle your project with undue burden as far as cost or time. We're simply assessing your project and comparing it with city code, and then letting you know what city code would say that you have to do. And we have to keep in mind, and Robert had this map as well, and our future land use map, that we have to be consistent across our jurisdiction, because that's what city code and master plan says. And really it's just to provide the proper and orderly growth for development and redevelopment of our city. So just keep that in the back of your mind. You know, we're here to help, and we're here to try to help guide you through to have a successful project. Sometimes we have to kind of pass along bad news, so to speak. Maybe you can't do the land use on your site that you had in mind, or maybe you can, but it would entail constructing public improvements. And I'll get into that here. Robert had this exhibit that's been available in the past, and I like this exhibit. I got to looking at this and thinking about it from it's a great way to condense a whole lot of code sections down into just kind of a roadmap. But even I got to thinking about it as if I had no prior experience. This would be a little intimidating to me as I looked at this, and so I kind of added a little bit on my own here to separate out. You know, really over here in the red, this is your information gathering part of the process, and this can just be an idea, it can be a concept plan, or you can even get to where you hire someone to put together a more refined site plan, but you're not committed to anything yet. You're not proceeding with your project yet. This is just more your due diligence phase. And this is where city staff, again, up here, either you call the planning help desk, or if they direct you to schedule a pre-application meeting, this is where we really kind of take stock of what your site is and what you're proposing to do, and then set you off on the path, either directly to building permit over here in the yellow, or through the boards and the public boards and the lengthier process here in the blue. So the questions that we ask ourselves are, and Robert discussed a lot of this, so I won't go into any great detail, but really it's plating and zoning. Do you have a legally platted lot? Do you have the zoning that allows your land use? So if, I'm going to jump around here a little bit. If you have a project and you meet with city staff and we say you don't need to go to planning board or city council, you can go straight to building permit. I'm going to talk about some of the things that we look at routinely on the public works side of things when you apply for a building permit. A single family residential building permit, that doesn't come to public works. We don't review those. You will need to provide sidewalks if they don't exist along your street frontage. You will need a residential driveway permit, but those are fairly straightforward and very flexible and kind of forgiving in what they allow. So there's a little bit of involvement with public works issues on single family residential, but if you're talking about a single lot, you're not going to encounter much as far as my department. So really it's more along the lines of multifamily, commercial, or industrial developments. That's where you're going to start to have some involvement with public works. If you're just doing interior work, you need a building permit to do interior stuff. That doesn't really bring about any public works requirements. It's really when you start to do site work on your property. So again, I alluded to sidewalks. That's something that we require. Technically, every lot in the city is supposed to have sidewalks. Unfortunately, there was a period in our city's history where they weren't always required. So effectively, your grandfather, I mean, we don't do a lot of proactive requirements for sidewalks. We don't go out and make you build them. But if you come to the city and ask for a building permit and you don't have sidewalks, we're going to make you build them along your frontage. Even if you would end up being the only person in your neighborhood to have them, you know, we have to start somewhere. And so just be aware that sidewalks are a common requirement. Stormwater is another requirement. If you are post-construction stormwater management plan, that really, PCSMP, that's an acronym that it boils down to two things. If you're disturbing 5,000 square feet or more on your site, there's two things you're going to have to provide for, which I'll get to here in a second. There's a link here to omahastormwater.org, and that's the city's portal to kind of provide the resources and information on the stormwater requirements, why we have stormwater requirements and what it entails. There's a hotline number if you have direct questions, you can call them. So essentially, the two things that you're going to have to keep in mind, first is no net increase in stormwater runoff. An engineer can assess your site and measure the amount of impervious coverage and pervious and impervious coverages and calculate the rate of stormwater discharge from your site and calculate how fast that happens and how much is discharged. And I just picked an example site here. This is Roncalli High School. Let's say they said, we want to tear out this football field and put in a parking lot expansion. So an engineer would measure the rate of runoff currently, given that it's grass here, and then they would calculate the runoff if it was pavement and calculate the difference, the net increase in stormwater runoff. As part of their building permit, they'd have to provide a stormwater plan, which included cost to provide infrastructure to slow the water down to mimic the current condition. And so the two main things that would entail would be a stormwater basin. You see those kind of excavated areas where stormwater flows into during a rain event and then gets more slowly discharged over time. On constrained sites, just be aware if you don't have enough room for above ground storage, there are options to bury pipes underground to have underwater detention. But just be aware that a stormwater plan involves the cost to hire an engineer to design the stormwater plan, and then the cost to construct the improvements up front, and then the ongoing obligation to maintain those on a permanent basis. I mentioned the two main items for a stormwater plan. The other would be that you have to treat the first half inch of stormwater for water quality. anything that falls on your site for stormwater is going to end up in a creek or a stream eventually. I guess in this case, this is like the very top of Coal Creek, but whether you're in a neighborhood or otherwise, eventually stormwater is going to end up in creeks and streams. So if you disturb, even if you remove existing pavement and replace it where you don't have to provide any detention, you still have to provide for stormwater quality. And that's to remove all the grit and oil from that first flush, that first half inch of stormwater. So just be aware that's an additional expense that you may be facing. So driveways is the third. So again, building permit plan, we're going to look at sidewalks, stormwater. Driveways is the other one. If your site work, there's some triggers, and I won't get into it, but if you trigger the application of the city's driveway regulations, then you're going to need to maybe remove or consolidate or relocate driveways, even if you have existing accesses. Sometimes the need is there to remove existing ones, and sometimes that's unpopular, but it goes back to driveways impacting traffic safety. There's an interaction there as far as the hazard level along a given street corridor. So just be aware, and I could talk all day about driveways, but if you are under those thresholds, the city won't require you to comply with the driveway regulations. But if what you're proposing to do with your site necessitates the application of the driveway regs, just be aware that that would be part of your building permit, is you'd potentially have to modify or even remove driveways.
Ryan, can I ask a question about the stormwater element? And I'm not sure I know how to phrase this, but I'm just curious. Does it matter? How do you take into account if something is you're losing permeable base, but it's not on on a larger site? So for instance, in that example you showed, that football field belongs to Ron Colley, so then they have to take into consideration the permeable basis for the whole site, which is like the whole campus of the school. But what if that land happened to belong to the park district or private owner or something, and they want to do the exact same thing? Is it evaluated the same way? Like, I guess what I'm sort of asking is, how do you take into account the permeable space around you, and how does that impact you? Or are you really looking at, is the whole universe just the site that you control when evaluating that?
If you're pulling a building permit on a single site, this would be the extent of what is evaluated. So we measure the impervious area on this site. In the pre-existing condition, we measure what you're proposing, and we take the difference, and you have to provide stormwater to get it back to this existing condition as far as the amount of runoff you create. If you're going to do a new development where it's my links are hidden here. If you're going to do a new development where it's like a neighborhood level subdivision, then you can do, instead of each home having a small basin, that doesn't make sense. What they'll do is they'll do a large basin to serve large areas, and they'll put those in separate outlots. So this is an example I pulled up out west, where there's there's hundreds of lots here, and all of the runoff comes down to a single consolidated basin. That's the most efficient way to do it. So it just depends on the setting and what is being proposed. But if your project is just a single lot, then yeah, your extents are only going to be the property line.
Okay, so basically you're responsible for getting it back to zero, no matter the scope of whatever it is that you're eliminating. You have to replace that in some way.
That's correct. And there are thresholds. If it's minor work, it doesn't come up. I believe 5,000 square feet is the magic number. And then, if you take an existing parking lot and all you're doing is milling and overlaying it, that's viewed as a maintenance action. That you're not even disturbing ground at that point, so that doesn't apply either. It's really just as soon as you put a shovel in the dirt, or remove and replace pavement, remove or replace a building, that's what's measured. Any other questions on stormwater or anything else before I move to the next section?
Thank you for that, by the way.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Like in areas where, a building or housing was removed historically, do you look at the today's impervious surface, or do you go back and look at the impervious surface that was there before?
That's a good question. I don't know the exact answer. I know there is a baseline reference date, and I think it was when they enacted the stormwater regulations in 2009. So they'll go back and look at what was in place historically at that time and then compare it to what's out there or what you're proposing to do today.
Okay. I was just thinking about like areas in East Omaha where, there was a lot of housing, and then, housing was removed, prior to 2009, and how does that impact future development? So
yeah, it's a good question. Okay, I'm going to jump in real quick and talk about, okay, so going back to thinking globally here, let's say that your project, you meet with city staff, you're ready to proceed with your project, but based on what you're proposing, you're not able to go directly to building permit. That's when you get into these public hearing, these board processes that Robert was alluding to, planning board, city council being the primary ones. If you need a use permit or a subdivision on your project, it does bring about some potential additional public improvements on your site or adjacent to your site. And when I say public improvements, when you have a given site and you want to do a project, typically you're just thinking in terms of with the areas within your property line, those are your private improvements. And really, we call them site improvements, even though they're technically out in the right of way, but also your sidewalks and your driveways. When you start to talk about public improvements, that's street paving, curb and gutter, storm sewer, sanitary sewer, street lighting, those kinds of things. So if you need a use permit or a subdivision, we're going to look at the adjacent rights of way to see if all of those things are sufficiently in place. A lot of redevelopment projects, the street's already there, the sanitary sewer's already there. So at that point, there's no requirements for additional public improvements, but that's not always the case. And it's really just a case-by-case analysis. So I pulled up another example here of a recent project down on 7th and Cedar. There was some homes in a greenhouse, and they acquired all the property and they wanted to replat it into about 30 buildable units, single-family units. And when we looked at the adjacent infrastructure, we noticed that Cedar Street is not improved on the frontage there. This happens in older parts of the city. Unfortunately, it happens historically where a subdivision was approved and maybe some of the infrastructure got put in. I mean, there's plenty of standard streets in this area, but for whatever reason, sometimes either sanitary sewer or paving and storm sewer was not constructed. And so that's what I was mentioning in the beginning there. We're not looking to have undue burden placed on a project, but we have to acknowledge that this was never originally constructed to that standard that everyone else had to. People don't realize that when you build a neighborhood, the cost for the street paving, the cost for the sanitary sewer, that's actually paid for by each lot owner on a frontage basis. So for whatever reason, that didn't happen here, and so no one had to pay for that. But so if you're triggering those processes and you're adjacent to some of these streets, be aware that that's an expense that you're going to have to provide for. And we can help you out with what, process-wise, with what that entails. We can guide you through it, but it is a cost. So again, it's really an assessment of the adjacent right-of-way to see if you have the standard infrastructure in place. Subdivision can also entail the dedications of right-of-way. We can look at other improvements like corner bump outs and on-street parking. And that sanitary sewer issue, that's a little tougher to look at maybe as a layperson, because it doesn't exactly jump off the page when you look at a plan. But again, that's why I pointed to the GIS is a good guide to show as far as what's out there for sanitary sewer. So I pulled up an example here, and I'll go through this just real briefly. If you owned this property here at Fort Street and 10th Street East, and you wanted to take it and split it into, let's say, 4 or 5 buildable lots, we would look at it and this is an unimproved street, so we would say we would support that subject to meeting the zoning code and going through the subdivision and rezoning process, potentially rezoning. But you would you, the developer, would have to pave along your frontage to city standards. And so not only would you have to provide for that pavement, but the subdivision code also requires you to construct public sanitary sewer adjacent to each lot. So this public sewer out here, you would have to have an engineer put together plans and provide for the construction of public sewer so that it abutted all of your existing lots. So that'd be an additional expense as well. So I don't want to scare you away from projects that have these things. We certainly have any number of them that we review and approve. And not all projects entail required public improvements, but that's why, just to stress the importance of this information gathering phase of your project, this is the place where we'll tell you what you're up against, whether you have public improvements that you're going to need to construct or not, whether you're even subject to those hearings and potential public improvements. So if you take away nothing else in my presentation, I would just strongly encourage you to reach out to the city anytime you have a potential project in mind, especially if it's something you don't own yet. Don't buy the property and then come and ask us, because we do have those meetings sometimes, and it's unfortunate. If you have something in mind, it can't always be feasible, or maybe it's feasible, but it is subject to the construction of those public improvements. So I just strongly encourage early coordination with city staff so we can kind of set you on the right path, knowing with the full knowledge of what you could potentially be up against as far as required public improvements. So with that, I'll open it up if anyone has any other questions.
I had one question. Is that kind of stormwater process something an engineer would normally automatically include as part of their planning for a new project?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're under the threshold or it's not required, then you just come in with your building permit without a PCSMP, a stormwater plan. But if you're over those thresholds, you will have to hire an engineer to put together those plans for you and include it with your building permit submittal.
All right, any other questions? All right.
Yeah, sorry, I had a question. I know we're all obviously in the middle of COVID. Are you guys taking face-to-face meetings? Do you have to make an appointment? What is the standard process right now?
Yeah, if you're directed from the planning help desk to schedule one of those pre-application meetings, we have a point of contact there that you call, and right now it's kind of optional at this particular point in time. But these situations are fluid, and in the past year we've gone all the way remote. At this time, if you want to come in and meet with us, some of the city staff are meeting physically, and the rest are dialing in remotely. So it's kind of a mix right now, and it's whatever you're comfortable with or not comfortable with. We can accommodate either one of those.
Wonderful, thank you.
Any other questions? Well, Ryan, thank you so much. This is very helpful, great information, and I know you'll be making this available for all the participants, so we'll make sure we get it to them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next, and I guess finally, we're going to have Tim share some information, and so I'm going to turn it over to him if he's ready.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. I, as I mentioned before, work in the urban design division. I'm going to give you some background in the urban design, our division, and particularly the urban design code and the sort of iterations it has gone through since it was developed. It was originally developed was adopted in 2007, was the first iteration, and it has gone through a kind of couple major additions to that. So I'm going to go through those and some urban design principles in general. First of all, Robert kind of went through those standard zoning regulations. So in your kind of standard zoning districts, you've got 10 to 12 different site development regulations that regulate things like density, building location and mass, setbacks, floor area ratio, all those things that, and also attempt to kind of mitigate external impacts. So requiring parking, having certain use restrictions. So what those things are really trying to do are really trying to fit development into these neat little boxes. And this works really well in greenfield development. So if you've got a piece of agricultural land that has nothing else on it, it is very easy to come in and say, it's kind of a blank slate. We're going to divide the lots up into sort of roughly evenly sized lots. All those lots are evenly sized, so the setbacks make sense. We can put a building in this little box on the property line and has a certain height, and that works great. The problem becomes is what do we do here, right? So this is a aerial photo of Benson, and you've got lots of things here from a standard zoning perspective that don't really work out very well. You've got commercial and residential uses right adjacent to each other, which is not necessarily bad, but the standard zoning code would try to separate those uses, have buffer yards between them, put them in different districts. But this is a reality. So how do we do development here? The standard zoning code doesn't really address that and actually prevents it. You've got parking lots next to single family homes, which is necessary sometimes, but when you've got a really big parking lot here that is taking up what could be developable space, that could be an issue. And you've also got setbacks that vary. So a lot of these neighborhoods were developed either before zoning was a thing or even around, and or different zoning regulations applied at certain times when development happened. So there's setbacks that aren't consistent, or in the case kind of on this side, the setbacks are consistent, but they're a lot of times a lot less than what that standard zoning code would allow. And so basically you kind of have this setup where you've got these standard zoning regulations which work really well in kind of greenfield development, but applying them to kind of East Omaha and infill development is difficult. So one question is, why don't we just get rid of the regulations? Well, the problem is that a lot of these neighborhoods were developed before the automobile, and they kind of became what they are out of necessity. People had to walk to the store, had to walk to the pharmacy. And those type of things that we now sort of want to see in our neighborhoods kind of organically developed. The problem is today is that the automobile is a major factor in any development, and we have to take that into account. Simply getting rid of the regulations would basically end up with something that was probably worse than trying to implement our standard zoning code, because the street would just basically be sort of consumed by the automobile. So while the intent of the standard zoning is valid, we're in those sort of urban areas, we have to take a more nuanced approach. So that's urban design. And that's kind of where this comes in. I like this definition from the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council. One thing I like about this definition is that it talks about urban design both being a process and an outcome. So it's not just kind of neighborhoods that we get at the end, but it's also the process that you have to go through to kind of get those neighborhoods that you want. And this graphic here on the right is also from that website. And what I think it really shows is that urban design has lots of different scales. It's on a macro scale, it's urban structure, it's transit systems, it's road networks, and it goes all the way down to building materials and design details and things like that on particular buildings. And so in order to kind of get good neighborhoods and to get good places, you have to take all those things into account. And as a result of that, the regulations that result in that are inherently more complex than a standard zoning form, which you have 10 to 12 site development regulations, and then that's it. We have to look at things like how do buildings address the street, how much frontage is there of a building, where is parking, where is it placed, that sort of thing. So just keep that in mind, that because we're regulating so many different things, that it's going to be more complex. So these are the three sort of major, I guess, milestones in urban design. It's specifically in Omaha. And I think it's important for those doing development in Omaha to understand these and kind of where they may apply and where they may not apply. The urban design division was formed in 2007 as a result of work that was done in 2000, the early to mid 2000s. And that was done in the form of a zoning code amendment called Article 22, which had urban design regulations, and then mainly a series of overlay districts that implemented those urban design standards. The initial sort of push of this was really focused on development in West Omaha. This was the mid 2000s when sort of laughably big box retail was a thing. And that is where a lot of the original design regulations kind of came from and applied to. It did have some elements that addressed setbacks in kind of the different from East Omaha to West Omaha. That's the one sort of place that it had some sort of regulations that kind of addressed more urban settings, but it was really mostly focused on West Omaha. We have amended it over time to apply to more urban settings, and these regulations range from neighborhood connectivity down to building design. So I'm going to go through that first, then these other two we'll kind of hit later. This is, and I'm going to, when you guys get the PDF for this of the presentation, these are hyperlinks, so you can go to these specific code sections if you want to dork out on it. But these are the elements that the first iteration really hit. They break down into three, I'm not going to go into them in specific detail, but they break down into three general categories. That would be roadside design, so how buildings sort of address the street and the public right-of-way sidewalk areas. They also do, reference site design, so talking like having increased landscaping and parking lots, burying utilities, screening service areas, that sort of thing. And then lastly, there's a section on building design, which deals with building materials, articulation of facade, and very specific things regarding to architecture and building design. Again, this is the building block, and we still use these in the other iterations of urban design. So it's important to know they exist and to look at them and to kind of understand them. The building design is probably the stickiest one, and hiring a good architect to help you through that is probably your best bet rather than trying to understand them all, but just kind of know that they are out there and what they regulate. How these were implemented was through overlay districts. Robert kind of briefly touched on this in his presentation. But an overlay district, real quick, it's added to the base zoning district and it modifies those regulations, and it's kind of denoted by a series of letters and numbers after the base district. So this is along Dodge Street. You see the properties up on the top. Those are just your standard R6, R7 zoning. Those standard zoning regulations apply. Down on Dodge Street, you see they've got, R8, but it's got this ACI 250. Those letters and numbers afterwards indicate that there is an overlay district, so you have to look for the regulations that are just beyond the standard zoning. And what were those overlay districts that were implemented as part of the urban design? The first one is the area of civic importance, or ACI, probably the most prevalent one. And these are major corridors and districts within the city. They downtown, north downtown, and midtown are kind of one big district. And then these other streets, Dodge Street all the way out to West Omaha, 72nd Street, 24th and 30th Street north of downtown, and 13th Street south of downtown are all designated ACI districts. And I have a map in a second that'll kind of show these. And so those basically implemented those elements of the urban design, those 10 or 12 elements in these districts. So those kind of updated urban design standards apply. The second overlay district is called the Neighborhood Conservation or Enhancement District, or NCE. There are a lot of three-letter acronyms I'm going to be throwing at you today, so you don't have to memorize them, but this is sort of shorthand when you get into this. If you say something like that you kind of figure out what these mean. These are a little different. These are unique districts with specific regulations. Right now, there are currently only 4 of them implemented. And so each one of these districts has its own standalone document that regulates the development within them, and they can vary greatly on how much they regulate certain things. They can incorporate all or some of those Article 22 elements, those urban design elements. Usually most of them have incorporated all of them, I believe. They can modify base zoning regulations. So the 10th Street NCE actually modifies R7 zoning districts, lowers the setbacks, changes them, and it can also make requirements more or less stringent. So the Millwork District NCE, which is our newest one, which I'm not sure if it's completely implemented yet, if it's past city council, but it's around the Mastercraft building, kind of north of downtown. And one thing they wanted to do is, because it was in former industrial areas, they wanted to relax some of the building design and building material requirements. And so they allowed things like corrugated metal panel and concrete masonry units that we would normally not allow buildings to be made completely out of. And they allowed it in that district because they wanted to have that kind of more industrial feel. So these are, if you end up finding a property and it's got an NCE overlay afterwards, that means that there's a specific document you need to find that will tell you kind of how development happens there. And then the last overlay district is a major commercial corridor, or MCC. These are most other major streets in the city. I refer to it as urban design light because it implemented most of the site and building design regulations. So what's specifically happening on the site, the building design, landscaping, that sort of thing, but it did not really implement the roadside design or building placement guidelines, that kind of first three items. And the reason for that is you can see in this map. So these are currently where these overlay districts are in place or plan to be in place. And the light green lines denote those MCC corridors. So because those MCC corridors have very different contexts, from on Center Street down by Field Club all the way out to West Omaha, we're really not trying to address the context. We're just trying to say that when development comes in on those corridors, we want the site to look good. We want the building to look good. We want increased landscaping, but we're not going to address how that site fits into the surrounding context.
Tim,
yep.
If I can interrupt real quick,
yep.
I think this map does a really good job of showing that where these ACI corridors, NCE districts are located at are in highly desirable neighborhoods to develop. These are places where people really want to develop. So these ACIs and where they're applicable could very well be in areas where people in this group want to develop. So I just thought that's worth pointing out.
Yeah, thanks. The one other thing this map shows, and I kind of mentioned it previously, is that there was an attempt with that ACI to take into account some context. And you can see that with there's these 4 different ACI districts from 1 through 4. And the major difference between these two is how it addresses building placement and where buildings should go on lots. The red, which is ACI 1, really requires that buildings that are developed in this area be placed close to the street, have entrances on the it's downtown and it's midtown. That requirement basically goes away when you get out into West Omaha, because there really isn't that context out there. It's, pad sites, it's AutoZone and McDonald's, and really addressing the street is not an important issue. It does have those site design things, so it does have increased landscaping on the site, but it doesn't have those kind of contextual requirements. So that's one thing kind of to note that the ACI did attempt to do with that implementation. So real quick, this is a kind of a matrix that shows those building design guidelines, or the kind of the elements, and then these overlay districts and where they apply and where they don't apply. You can kind of see in the ACI 1, they basically all apply. This MCC, they don't. Those kind of more contextual roadside conditions don't apply. And then in the NCE, basically it's kind of look at that document, see what applies and doesn't apply, because there's going to be a specific document that regulates that. So That's the first iteration of urban design in Omaha in a nutshell. So what it did do is it did bring sort of elements of urban design to Omaha and was important in kind of beginning that discussion. But what it didn't do was really address issues with standard zoning and how infill housing works, as we kind of talked about at the very beginning. So the second thing that was implemented as far as urban design goes has to do with the planned unit redevelopment, or PUR, and the infill design guidelines. So this was a process that was developed specifically to address infill housing, and the design guidelines are a standalone document that are meant to guide that process. It's important to note that this is, so it's not a comprehensive zoning solution. So it's not, it doesn't have specific regulations in the PUR, it's more of a process, but it does reference the sort of urban design standards in Article 22 and these infill design guidelines. And it's also important to note these are approved on a case-by-case basis. So they're kind of one-off things. You come in and you get one of these approved and that's it. And then another one would be a totally different plan. And you'll see the reason for that in a second. So again, these are meant to, this is a process that you have to go through to get these specific plans approved. The reason it was done this way is because coming up with a comprehensive zoning solution that allows for infill, things like a form-based code, are very expensive and take a lot of time. And this was sort of seen as a sort of stopgap measure to kind of test out some principles and see what worked and what didn't work. And so what this does is you come in, you have a meeting with the planning department, have an idea of, you know, a specific lot, a plan you want to do. And what we do is we look at that. We look at how it relates to the standard zoning code and what waivers you would need from the zoning code to allow that development to happen. What it allows us to do is incorporate the waivers so that you would normally go to the Zoning Board of Appeal for, that we, as Robert talked about, we generally can't support those. But as part of this PUR process, you're going to the planning board and city council, and you're getting those waivers approved as part of that plan. And as a trade-off for those waivers, you're incorporating these urban design elements that we want to see in these neighborhoods. So that's kind of the, and again, it's not a, it doesn't say specifically how big your setback has to be. It looks at each site contextually and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense and what kind of waivers do you need. Where can we put landscaping, you know, that sort of thing. So it's a really kind of hands-on process. This is how a majority of the infill development has been done in Omaha in the last 5 years. So if you have something, if you can go in and develop it and meet a base zoning code, if you already have R7 zoning and you can meet those requirements, that's going to be your easiest path. But a lot of times you can't because of all the issues with standard zoning. And so this is your process forward. The infill and redevelopment guidelines were the document that was meant to kind of guide this process. I'm going to go over the top kind of half of these because it's kind of, I think, important to understand. This is how buildings are kind of placed in infill, you know, and how parking is handled. The top, all of these things are in the are in these infill guidelines, and there's a link at the top to that so you can look at it. But I'm going to go over this top half because I think it's important to kind of understand what the city is going to look for if you come in with a project. The first one of those, and probably the most important, has to do with orientation. So how is the building oriented in relation to the street? And what we're going to want to see is that it is oriented toward the street with main building entrances on the street. That can take the form of, you know, buildings with an actual entrance. That can be a U-shaped building with a court where the actual building entrance is set back, but there's some sort of landscape feature, or even this type of configuration where you've got multiple buildings that sort of face internal to the site, but there's some sort of entrance feature that's out on the street that denotes that this is the entrance to this sort of development. We had a development on Park Avenue that kind of used this model that works pretty well. What's not appropriate: buildings, blank walls facing the street, buildings with no entrances on the street. What's probably the worst is parking garages with giant driveways and curb cuts. If you come in and you want to do infill development and you're proposing something like this, the first we're going to say is that's not going to work. you got to work on your building orientation. The second thing is a public to private transition. This is most important in residential development, so apartments or townhomes. And it's really providing a separation between the public and private realms. And that's done through the use of a porch, a stoop, something that's connected to the architecture, but is still outside, kind of just provides a little buffer, a little transitional space that can also be setting the ground floor of buildings up off the street level a little bit by a couple feet, helps provide that sort of transition. Again, this is most important in residential development. It's not so important in commercial development, because in commercial development, like in this case down here, we want to have buildings really close to the street. We want windows so people can see in, see what's going on inside the space. The people outside can watch the activity on the street. So having this visual connection and transparency, we still want that on residential developments, but it's kind of a little more subdued, setback, and kind of is mitigated a little bit with that public to private transition. So visual connection, transparency, also important, and also front yard setback. So what we want to have is have a common setback. So if you're coming in and one of these lots is vacant and you're doing development, the expectation would be is that your building would be set in line with these other buildings that are already on the street. We don't want it set back, and we don't want it set forward, because it interrupts that sort of street wall that's created by the buildings. So, and then lastly, or close to lastly, one of them is sidewalks and landscaping. This is really important because a lot of times people will come in and they'll say, okay, I have this lot. Well, my property line's here, so I'm going to develop up to this point. Well, part of urban design is having good sidewalks and landscaping in the right of way. And a lot of times what happens in larger developments is we will actually have you dedicate right of way to the city in order to create good sidewalks and landscaping and on-street parking in these areas. The trade-off is you might lose a little bit of property, but we're allowing you to build more dense, have more units, and we're kind of creating a good streetscape. So it's part of the urban and infill guidelines, and just keep in mind that, you know, don't just assume with a development that you're going to be able to build out to the property line. Sometimes you will have to dedicate right away to make sure that we get these features installed. Parking is also a huge thing with the PUR. That is parking quantity. So frequently what we do is we waive the number of required stalls. The zoning code, the standard zoning code, requires a lot more parking than is needed, especially in infill development where you have transit. Also, parking eats up a lot of space. You know, surface parking where could be developed into housing, and also garage parking is expensive. So generally what we do is we waive parking down to a 1 space per 1 unit ratio. Currently, it's 1 space for a studio unit, but a 2-bedroom, let's say an apartment building, requires 2 parking stalls. So the number of parking stalls required can get inflated. So with this PUR, we will often waive the parking quantities. And we can also give you credit for adjacent on-street stalls, bike parking, and proximity to transit. So a lot of times your required parking gets down to 1 space per 1 unit, but if you're allowed to use adjacent on-street stalls, you might be providing less parking on site than even the 1 space to 1 unit. So that is a frequent request. And parking location, this is maybe arguably more important than building orientation because it's frequently overlooked. The 2 big no-nos are we do not want surface parking between the building and the street on your property. On-street parking is okay, but not between the building and the street. And we don't want driveways and parking garages or garages facing the street with lots of curb cuts, driveways. If you come in with a development that's proposing that, it's going to be an issue. So that can be solved a number of ways. You can have parking in a building if you're doing a larger project. That's best below grade so that the first floor can be usable space, commercial or residential. You can do parking on the first floor. It's great if you've got a grade change. So in this picture, the grade drops off here, and you can, in the lower part, you can access the parking. And then, you know, as the grade goes up, you can have less of that sort of blank first floor parking facing the right of way. If you do have it, you can use landscaping, building materials to kind of mitigate it. If you do have this sort of development and you've got a bunch of garages and driveways, really doing those off an alleyway, which is what this picture is trying to show, is there's sort of rear access. The fronts of the buildings are on the other side and the parking is on the back. Same if you want to do surface parking, that it's on the back of the building and hidden, and that you and that the other big thing is minimizing the width and number of vehicle access points to these developments, so that you have minimized curb cuts and that sort of vehicular pedestrian conflict points. So that's the PUR. It's probably, if you're doing infill development right now, most likely, if you're not kind of in downtown or close to Dodge Street, the process you would be going through. The last one, which is our newest urban design district, is our transit-oriented development. This was just passed last year. It's meant to address development within a half mile of the orbit route. It's a new base zoning district. So the other ones that we did were overlay districts. These are a new base zoning district, and so they have their own site development regulations. So again, this kind of builds on the previous two iterations. We amended the stuff in Article 22 to take into account TOD. As part of the process of developing the code, we looked at the PURs we did and what are the waivers we typically, are incorporated that, and we basically bake that into the TOD. And so transit-oriented development, real quick, is just development located around a transit. Ideally, it's rail because they have kind of more fixed and more permanent stations, but we don't have rail, so ours is focused around the BRT route. And what it kind of does is tries to be a win-win situation and maximize transit by locating development around it, and that makes more people use the transit and makes it more popular, but also sort of increases the tax base for the city, makes better neighborhoods. That's kind of the goal. In Omaha, so it is a new base zoning district, as I mentioned. One of the things is that this was not we're rezoning these as projects come in. This was not something that we proactively went in and rezoned, a bunch of properties up and down Dodge Street with this TOD zoning. We're basically, if somebody comes in previously where we might have done the PUR, we now have this TOD district and we say, okay, what are you doing? And having those projects fit in with that new zoning and rezoning to TOD. Again, it kind of builds on our previous efforts. There are 6 districts, and they're based on proximity to the BRT station, uses and building types allowed, and the street type, which is different than any of our other zoning code. It takes into account whether you're on an arterial or a local street. It does have some new requirements as far as minimum building frontage. So how much of a street frontage needs to be occupied by a building or pedestrian space, reduced buffer yards. In residential areas has maximum building footprint. So trying to, rather than come in with a big apartment building in a residential neighborhood, it requires them to break that maybe up into 2 or 3 smaller buildings. So that minimizes the conflict with the residential development that's there. Step backs, which has to do with building height. It can only go up a certain height and then has to step back before it goes up any higher. Reduce parking requirements, and it does limit some uses. This is the map of the different districts. The TOD, so the pink and red colors here, you'll note the second set of letters is MX, that's in for mixed use. So what that means is those are mixed use, so commercial or residential development is okay in those kind of MX districts that are denoted in the red and the pink colors. The brown and yellow tones have different letter, but basically they're residential districts. So only residential development is allowed. There is not any commercial development allowed in those kind of brown and tan districts. The different TOD 1, 2, 3, and 4 is kind of a contextual thing. TOD 1 is the most intense, highest buildings, down to TOD 4, which is really single family or residential neighborhoods with just accessory dwelling units, mostly is all that's allowed there. So it's kind of an intensity The TOD 1, 2, 3, and 4 is a code of intensity, and then the letters afterwards tell you whether or not you can do commercial or you can't. You'll notice there's kind of a big gap in the middle. The reason for that is UNO and Elmwood Park, Memorial Park, and then also the residential neighborhoods in this area are some of them are designated historic. And so we really tried to take into account those neighborhoods and really kind of focus the TOD effort on neighborhoods where it would make more sense rather than putting them in historic neighborhoods. So that's why there's that kind of big gap in the middle and some of these other smaller gaps in other places. And this is my last slide. We're almost done. This is the code regulations, just some sections to kind of give you an idea of the difference between the different districts. There's different lot size requirements, setback requirements, but this bottom one kind of really gets at what we're trying to do with the different intensity districts 1, 2, 3, and 4 and these different street types over here. So you'll notice basically if you're on an arterial street, which is the most intense street, you're allowed to have a bigger building footprint, bigger building heights. But as you step down into those more local streets, those footprints get smaller, the building heights get smaller. And so that was kind of, this table is kind of really important to kind of denote that that's the attempt with TOD to kind of mitigate those impacts to some of those residential neighborhoods and to step down the intensity of the development kind of depending on the street type. So that is all I had. I know it was a lot of information. There's my email and phone number. Feel free to call me or email me if you have any questions, or I'll take what I can now. I know we're like right at noon.
This is incredible. This is a ton of information. Thank you so much, Tim.
Yep.
Daniel has a question in the chat about applying to have curb cut back for street parking. Daniel, do you want to jump in and ask that real quick?
Yeah, sure. I know some streets in Little Italy are bigger and have larger sidewalk areas. And I know that the CO2 building at 1502 South 10th Street, they had cut back some of the green space towards the sidewalk for parking. We manage in a lot of properties down there, and we're doing some redevelopment. So I was just curious about what that process looks like.
Yeah, it's and Ryan can jump in too, because it's kind of something that planning and public works does together. It really depends on what the existing street is. Sometimes, yeah, there's existing right of way. The lanes are already, really wide, and it makes sense and it's easy to cut in that parking. The other thing that we've been really taking into account in lately has to do with the context. So if you're on 10th Street, that's a pretty reasonably busy street. Diagonal parking kind of makes sense. What we've really gotten away from is, even if you have the space, is to do diagonal parking in like residential neighborhoods that have, if there's just currently sort of on-street parking that's parallel, starting to add in diagonal parking starts to make it look like a parking lot. And from an urban design standpoint, it's just more pavement and can, it can, you allow it one place and then it's down the block, and the next thing you know, you've got 2 blocks of diagonal parking, which take what was maybe more of a residential feel with more landscaping and sort of more of a residential feel, and kind of turns it into what looks kind of like a parking lot. So it's kind of a case by case basis, because it depends on, again, how much is there extra street right of way? Are you willing to dedicate? Because the other issue is that you have on-street parking, that's fine, but then you also have to have a sidewalk on the back side of the parking, which has to be 7 feet. And then you have to have your property line. So there might not be, well, it might look like there's enough space depending on your property line is, there might not be, or you might have to dedicate right away in order to get to that point. So if you have properties that you think you'd like to do it, what I would suggest is give us a call, set up a pre-application meeting or something, and we can talk through it.
Yeah, part of the reason I asked that is because I know that the CO2 building has done that on 10th Street, but we have about 10 duplexes in the same vicinity on 10th Street, and they don't have garages. So parking has been an issue, but we're going to be following through with a lot of remodel on these buildings and bringing them back, but we really want to fix or address the parking issue. So if that was an option for us, that would be really great.
You know, I would say if you're in proximity to that, and again, on 10th Street, there is that 10th Street NCE plan. So that is one of the districts that has that specific kind of zoning plan. So you really want to look at that when it comes to, you know, if you have existing buildings and you're renovating them, you know, a lot of that stuff probably isn't going to apply, especially if it's just interior stuff. But looking at that plan, we've done other stuff with the new elementary school that's going in on 10th Street. So when you kind of have more plans fleshed out, you can certainly give us a call and we can kind of talk through it and see if that's a possibility.
Yeah, we have some bids for some higher dollar. We're redoing the whole fronts of the buildings and all of the landscaping out front. So if the parking deal was an option, we wanted to look at that sooner than later. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, if you are redoing the facades, the building design standards probably apply. So depending on what they are currently and what you're changing them to, you know, that's something to take into account. So.
Okay.
I am so sorry to have to cut this off, but we're already a couple minutes after 12 and we've got another afternoon session to host for a different group. So I am really sorry to do this, but everyone has the contact information that was shared by our presenters, and we'll also be sending out all the presentation links that they gave. And we also have the recording of this session that we'll share. So lots of information coming your way. Please join us for our next session on City of Council Bluffs 101. And then we also have that historic tax credit session. If you are interested in applying for the Developer Academy, if you haven't participated in the past, please be on the lookout for that application coming out next week. And stay tuned for more sessions for later this year. So thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.
Incredible. Tons of great information.